Hi everyone, our first speaker is Alex Schwing. Alex is an assistant professor at UIUC and he has done some very interesting work on learning and reasoning with graph structured representations. Most relevant to this workshop are his works on fact-based visual question answering and also generating diverse questions and captions. And today I think Alex is going to talk about diversity in captions and questions. And we're looking forward to hearing from you.
All right, thanks so much for this introduction, and thanks so much for inviting me to give a talk here. What I really want to talk about is, or first give you like a big picture of what myself and a talented set of students at UIUC care about, which is learning to anticipate. And the set of students are really the ones that deserve all the credit. So here is a subset of them. And they're the ones that really make all this work. So that everything I talk about is essentially their work. Now, I guess it comes at no surprise to all of you if I'm telling you that computer vision and machine learning have been incredibly successful in the past couple of years. And I would argue that models which analyze work very well, right? We have achieved incredible success and good accuracies at tasks like image classification, object detection, semantic segmentation, and human pose estimation. So are we done? Well, I guess we wouldn't all be here if we were done. So what do we want to achieve, right? And I would argue that what we really care about is we want to personalize our life. Other people call this automate, but I prefer the word personalize here. And what I think is missing in order to achieve personalization is models which actually anticipate. Now, let me try to make this very clear. What do I mean by that? Right, assume you're in a car driving by those two kids that are hassling each other chasing a ball. Right? You would slow down and you would be very cautious about it. Why would you be cautious about it? Well, because you're wondering whether the kids are stepping aside or whether they are running into the middle of the road without actually yielding to oncoming traffic. Now, when I'm saying you're wondering about it, what you're actually doing is you're running mental simulations. And some of those mental simulations, some of those outcomes are extremely unfavorable. So you'll start to become cautious. And I would argue that at this point in time, we don't have any models, any computer vision models that allow us to do anything of that sort. So we want to build these types of models. And the question is, how can we do that? In order to do that, I would argue that we need to combine the vision of David Marr, which is 2D to 3D reasoning, with the vision of two very famous neuroscientists, Rodolfo Llinás and Kenneth Craig. What they were arguing for is a creature, and I quote here, a creature must anticipate the outcome of a movement in order to navigate safely. So what we are really missing is this anticipation behavior. And in order to be able to develop models that anticipate, I think we need at least 4 ingredients. We need adequate interaction reasoning. We need, and we have that as humans as well, a lot of priors, and we need to understand how can we encode those priors into models. We obviously need to understand the objects holistically, and we need to be able to capture ambiguity in this world. And it is this last aspect about capturing ambiguity that I want to talk about a little bit, particularly in the context of visual question answering and image captioning. Now, since factual visual question answering was mentioned in the intro, I wanted to briefly show you what was talked about here. So here's the model that we designed, and this was joint work with Medini and Lana, where you're given an image and you're given the corresponding question, and you're tasked to answer that question, right? Standard VQA. However, different from standard VQA, the question requires you to reason or to take into account a knowledge base. And the knowledge base consists of a very large number of facts. And we were wondering, how can we take this large number of facts effectively into account? Searching over 100,000 of facts is very time consuming. So what we did, and what you can see here on the left-hand side, is first a model that constrains the fact space to a total of the top 100 facts that we can very easily predict. And I guess you can see that here at the bottom right side. Now, once you have this 100 facts, these are the facts that are probably most related to the question and the image that you observe. Now, you need to reason more carefully about the entities within these facts. And in order to do that, we designed a graph convolutional net, and you can see some depiction of that on the right-hand side, which then builds a graph based on the retrieved facts and allows you to reason about the entities, trying to retrieve that entity that will make up the answer. And for the details, I refer you to the paper, and sorry for making this just a quick plug. It wasn't actually intended to be in this presentation. So what I really wanted to get at is this modeling of ambiguity aspect here. So if you look at an image like the one that I'm showing you here, and if I ask you, right, what are you interested in? And I'll ask everyone in this room here, then I would get a whole range of different answers, right? Presumably, some of those answers would cover the same objects in the image, but many answers would actually be quite diverse. So the one thing that we were wondering about is how can we capture this diversity, right? And one of the first projects that we did in this direction is, can we develop models that permit to ask a diverse set of questions about a given image, right? Like the image that I'm showing you here again, and the questions that the design model came up with are like, is there a candle burning? How many people are in the room? What kind of wine is the woman drinking? And so on and so forth. Now, noticeably, all those questions are related to the image, and all those are valid questions. So how did we do that? So I guess the general goals are, how can we obviously generate diverse questions or diverse descriptions about an image that reflect the content? But we don't only want to generate diverse questions, we also want to be able to actually control this diversity. And then we want to generally build mechanisms that anticipate, right? If I start asking a question about an image, very likely after the first few words, you will be able to complete that question and come up with something that is pretty much similar to what I would have come up with. So how can we build this anticipation behavior into image questioning or captioning? All right, let's take a step back, right? If we want to answer this, what were the classical techniques for doing that? Well, I guess the first technique that Barnard and others came up with in 2003 were retrieval-based methods. Right? You're given an image, and you're given a large database of questions or descriptions, and you're retrieving those descriptions. Now, that works well if you're focused on a very specific goal, or if you're related or concerned about a very specific context, for instance, sports games. However, if you want to ask questions or come up with descriptions about arbitrary images, then this obviously limits your scope quite significantly. So can we generalize this? And in fact, the next techniques that people then developed extract image representations. They form an energy and extract highest scoring captions, for instance, via diverse beam search and newly developed variants, one of which actually just appeared, I guess, last week at ICMI. And those are nice techniques. However, they require you to model a complex energy function and then sample in this complex energy landscape. And that is often computationally very demanding. And we don't want to generate a lot of questions or descriptions and waiting forever to come up with this form of diversity. So we were wondering, isn't there something, faster, more adequate? And thinking about this, there's a couple of techniques, particularly generative modeling techniques like GANs and variation autoencoders that actually perfectly fit this scenario. So I guess one of the first works in this direction that Unat and Siyu, two of the students that I was working with, or am working with, came up with is this model that I'm showing you here on the right-hand side. It extracts an image representation, and you can see that at the bottom left of the image. And that image representation is then fed into an encoder stage to come up with this latent representation in some manifold space, which is then subsequently decoded, and that's the second yellow box on the right-hand side to extract the caption in this, the question in this case. Now, how to train this model? Well, if you're familiar with variational autoencoders, you know that you can train these models end-to-end. So we can jointly train both the encoder and the decoder to come up with these representations. Now, importantly, because we have this latent space in the middle, we can actually sample from this latent space, and we can very quickly generate new questions. Right? So how would you run this model during inference? Well, during inference, you start at the red boxes. You're just sampling from this latent space, and the samples that you draw are simply from a Gaussian distribution. You feed those samples through the decoder, and you obtain a set of descriptions, questions, whatever it is that you care about. And this actually worked remarkably well. So here I just show you the encoders and the decoders that we use. There's classical LSTM-based encoders and decoders. So for the encoder, you start with the image representation. You then feed it through a sequence of LSTMs to obtain, for the encoder, the mean and the log standard deviation. And for the decoder, you take, again, the image representation as an input to the first time step of the LSTM. And then the encoded sample Z that you draw from the Gaussian distribution with mean mu and standard deviation log sigma squared, you feed that through the LSTM chain to obtain probabilities over words, which during training you can then use to compute the logless. And you can train this with standard log likelihood or by maximizing the empirical lower bound more precisely. Okay, so how well does all this work? Well, here are a couple of results for some images, and you can see here that similar to the one that I showed you initially, this actually works reasonably well. Right, if you look at one of the images, say the one in the bottom center, it's asking whether the man is wearing a helmet, what's the man wearing on his head, what does this man have on his back, and so on and so forth. So all those are questions that are related to the content that you see in the image. And in particular, I want to emphasize that all those questions are generated word by word. So we are not retrieving those questions from a database, but we are really producing questions word by word. And you can see that all of them are semantically correct. In addition, we highlighted with tick marks here the questions that have never ever been observed in the training set. So it doesn't entirely memorize the training set. It really is able to come up with new questions. Obviously, the model is not always successful. Here are a couple of failure cases. Right, if you look at, for instance, the image on the left-hand side, admittedly, it's kind of a strange-looking plane. And the model asks about whether these planes, plural, are flying in formation. So it's not able to discern that this is actually a single plane. Also, if you're looking at the image on the right-hand side, it's kind of asking about the green vegetable on the plate, despite the fact that there is no green vegetable on the plate. And why is it asking these questions? And you can see that by the insets, usually on the training data, there's a lot of greens in the data sets, particularly when it's related to food items. So it essentially picks up on those biases, and it then, whenever it sees food items, it just assumes that there must be something green there, and I can ask a question about greens. Okay. Now, obviously, we don't want to generate random questions about images, right? Is that actually any good? So the next question that we were wondering about then is how can we make this more controllable, and also how can we make more diversity? And I'll show you the results for diversity of this model in a bit. And in order to do that, and this is joint work with Liwei and Lana at UIUC, we designed a conditioning mechanism that allows us to condition on undetected objects, or objects that you want to pay attention to. And the encoder and the decoders that you can see here are effectively very similar to the ones that I showed you before, so not much of a change there, except for the encoder now has not a single Gaussian that it learns, but instead it has means and standard deviations for k different Gaussians, k being a hyperparameter, and it essentially focuses on the different objects. It allows you to focus on the different objects that are in the image. And the decoder is essentially built in the same way, and you can then actually mix those different Gaussians together to generate captions that contain the objects that you detected. And just to give a few examples, here are some results where we are comparing this model. We call this the additive Gaussian conditional variation autoencoder, the AGCVAE. And you can see that for the different detected objects or objects that we condition on, the model actually produces those in the corresponding sentences, which was nice to see. Some results, and sorry for putting up all these numbers here. I guess the one thing I probably want to highlight is that compared to classical techniques like long short-term memory networks, you can see that the additive Gaussian CVAE, which is shown in the bottom, I guess, fourth, works actually quite similarly, yet it gives roughly the same results in terms of metrics. Whether or not they're good, that's a different question. But it produces the same results, yet it allows you to sample diverse captions, which was encouraging to see. Now, I'm kind of focusing on this diversity aspect a bit, and obviously the one thing you're wondering about is, how well does it do on diversity, right? How many different 2 grams is it able to produce, and how many different 4 grams is it able to produce? And I'll show you that in the plots here on the left-hand side, 2 grams, on the right-hand side, 4 grams, and over different word positions. So you can see that for the first word position, the diversity is fairly limited, which makes sense if you look at the data set. Many of the descriptions start with or the, and obviously the model learns to these biases and picks up on those. So what you can also see, however, is that techniques like beam search and diverse beam search perform actually fairly well. And the additive Gaussian conditional VAE that I talked about, while doing reasonably well, can't actually quite compete, at least in terms of diversity metrics, with beam search or diverse beam search. Yet it is obviously much faster because it doesn't require you to search multiple beams. So while we are doing fine in terms of speed and sometimes the metrics, diversity wasn't really encouraged as much as classical techniques, I would argue. So what are we missing out on? What is not there yet? Well, so we were wondering about this quite a lot, and one of the things that we realized was that those standard long short-term memory networks that you're training with, they are oftentimes overly confident when it comes to word predictions. And when you're overly confident with regards to with regards to your output probabilities, then sampling from this output space doesn't really give you much diversity. So we were wondering whether we can address this confidence issue. And the one thing that we tried was to then develop convolutional encoders and decoders. And this is joint work with Jyoti and Aditya. They're both sitting somewhere in the back there, I think. Now, in addition to this model being less confident, what it also allows you to do is actually to train in parallel, which is very convenient because you can process your data much faster than performing this back propagation through time that you're used to if you're using LSTM and encoders and decoders. Also, it's less prone to vanishing gradients. We found it to be more memory efficient. And you can actually explicitly control the receptive field by changing the width of your convolution. A convolution which is only allowed to look backward in time, obviously. And that part is going to become important going forward. Now, during testing, the model is not parallel anymore during testing because you need to first produce the first word. You need to run this model sequentially. Yet, if you look at the results, we found something quite surprising. So on the left-hand side here, you can see then the negative log likelihoods of the model, and in red you can see the LSTM, and in blue you can see the convolutional architecture. So at first, looking at the left-hand side plot, we were kind of discouraged, right? It doesn't enable us to fit that model as accurately as an LSTM decoder does. Obviously, we quickly tried it, and we looked at the accuracy metrics, and you can see the accuracy metrics in the center. And that was surprising. The accuracy metrics are actually, for the convolutional encoder, are probably pretty much the same or slightly better than what you'd observe from an LSTM. So what's going on? Well, the only explanation could be that, as I alluded to initially, the convolutional architecture is less confident in its predictions. So we looked at the entropy terms, and you can see those entropy terms on the right-hand side, and the entropy is higher for the CNN architectures, which was again encouraging because our initial intuition was confirmed that we are less confident in our predictions, and thereby hopefully we are able to gain more diversity, which was the next thing that we looked at. And you can see, compared to a standard LSTM architecture, diversity metrics, again 2 grams and 4 grams, are improved, slightly improved. But again, you know, not a major boost, I would argue, but at least some boost, which was, as I said, encouraging to see, and which is one of the architectures, you know, that we continued using going forward. But obviously, what we did lose on the way is again this controllability aspect. And what we were interested in going forward is to put this controllability aspect in. And this is now joint work with Jyoti, Aditya, and David, which is going to appear at this year's CVPR. I don't exactly know, sometime in 2 days, something like that. And what we wanted to achieve here is, again, produce descriptions of images, but now, again, be able to control them. But instead of using objects, detected objects, to control what descriptions we produce, we wanted to focus on part of speech descriptions to get a more fine-grained control of individual word tags. So instead of having a single vector that controls how to come up with a description, we wanted to have a more fine-grained control that starts to focus on individual words. So what you can see here in this model that I'm illustrating is, I guess, 3 different parts. The first part on top in this pink or reddish color is a part of speech, a standard part of speech classification technique that comes up with part of speech tags for every possible word position, which are then encoded via an LSTM network. In the bottom part, you see the standard image representation architecture. You run your favorite CNN. You get some FC7 representations, maybe some object representations if you desire to do so. You feed them together with your encoded speech representation into a final CNN to produce the individual words for your captioning network. And so we're wondering, okay, how well does this conditioning on individual word aspects actually work? And here we're comparing against, again, beam search, diverse beam search, the AG-CVAE that I talked to you about, and POS is the model that I just introduced, which is the part of speech tagging and part of speech joint, like joint end-to-end training. You can see in terms of metrics, it again does fairly well, which is encouraging. It also runs very quickly during inference. You don't have to run diverse beam search. It's literally just a forward pass, which is exciting to see. And also, in terms of diversity, it does reasonably well. So what I'm showing you here is for 20 samples, the best, like the first caption, the highest scoring caption, the second highest scoring caption, third highest scoring caption, and so on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, what is the corresponding CIDR accuracies. And I'm sorry for the plot, somehow that doesn't look very sharp, even on my screen. And you can see the green curves are the diverse beam search curves. Diverse beam search does still do remarkably well here, but the POS techniques actually come really, really close. Same thing for 100 samples. And if you look at the unique 2 grams and 3 grams, same plot that I showed to you earlier, you can actually see that now this does a lot better, which was very encouraging to see. So what was the distinguishing feature? What allowed us to improve significantly on this 2 gram and 4 gram metrics? And the one unique aspect that I want to emphasize here is the focus on this part of speech tags. The fact that we are now encouraging individual word positions. And that was something that I guess going forward we are currently working on, and we call this the SEG-CVAE model, which is a variational autoencoder with 1 latent sample per word. And in addition, it has a temporal prior model, which is trying to capture the intention, and we have now also a forward and backward encoder that is kind of trying to encode what is the sentence or the description, what all the description looked like, right? Trying to anticipate what is happening. And I guess that model looks slightly more complicated, so let me try to break this down in the last minute that I have, which is, it's again an autoencoder type model. So we remain with the autoencoder architecture. And you can see in green the encoder, in red the decoder, and then in blue the prior. Now, different from the earlier techniques that I showed you, the prior is now an LSTM as well. So it's not just a simple Gaussian, and it's an LSTM per word. Different from the earlier models as well, the encoder is now a forward-backward LSTM, and importantly, the backward pass allows you to capture what is the sentence, what should the sentence look like going forward. And so what we, during training, try to achieve is for the prior to capture the remaining parts of the sentence, the future of the sentence, and this is this ability to anticipate. And the decoder is just the standard decoder that we used. All right, I'll skip through these parts. Brief look at the numbers. Okay, looks all good. Fine. Diversity metrics, again, very encouraging to see that the diversity metrics are on par with POS or even better than POS in some cases. So I guess lesson learned, the one crucial thing that really matters is to focus on the ambiguity, not on a sentence level, but actually on a word-by-word level. Here are some qualitative results, which are at some point in time going to appear on arXiv or in some paper, I hope. And to sum up and make sure that I finish somewhat on time, what I talked to you about is VQG methods, image captioning, convolutional techniques for captioning, conditioning on part of speech, more fine-grained conditioning, and then this last model, which has latent spaces per word. I want to emphasize that, according to our opinion, diverse results should be fast to obtain, they should be controllable, and they should be accurate. And I do have to tell you that we did try a lot of different approaches, and it was not easy to always maintain accuracy while achieving good results on diversity. So we did struggle quite a bit, but I guess the lesson learned from this is that I hope that these things will help us develop more detailed models for learning to anticipate, not only in when talking about image descriptions, but when talking about images and representations for images. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex, for the great talk. We have time for a few questions.
What's the intuition of the Y convolution that leads to higher entropy?
So the question was, what's the intuition for why convolutional nets lead to higher entropy? That's a great question. I think convolutional nets have less parameters that we train, whereas the LSTM in this case had more parameters. So it had probably more capacity and therefore was overly confident. But generally, we haven't explored this question too much. So yeah, good question. I don't really have a concrete or precise answer.
Yeah, there's a question there.
I have a question about the same part of the talk. So it seems like for either the LSTM or the CNN, you can vary the entropy on the output by adding a temperature term. Like you put a temperature term into a softmax. So, I mean, yeah, my question is, well, put a temperature term into the LSTM to make it more diverse. Does that make a difference in a way?
Right, so that's a good question, and indeed we did think about that as well. Right, and if you think about it, you have your softmax and you just divide by some temperature. Now, if you train your LSTM and say you don't have any weight decay, your standard DeepNet will actually learn to ignore this division by some factor, because the weights can just scale arbitrary. So we didn't find these temperature terms to make much of a difference if there is no weight decay in there. Because the DeepNet will just scale its weights and therefore scale its output. So we did not find just simple scaling with entropy terms to make too much of a difference, unless we really cranked up these temperature parameters, at which point we started to see significant drops in accuracy.
Okay.
I have two questions. The first question is, what's the purpose of the clustering generation? So, I think it's okay we have clustering generation in visual dialogue or in go-oriented dialogue generation, because we need the clustering to gather more information or lead to the further dialogue. But in your case, it looks like there's no big difference between the clustering generation and the image captioning. So, what's the purpose of this clustering generation? Can we use that to produce more, better model for the VQA?
Right, so I guess let me emphasize that much of what I actually talked about is image captioning. So only the first model that I talked about was about question generation. Reason why we started with question generation is because we did want to look into visual dialogue, and we did want to understand both aspects of how can we generate questions. And really the main purpose, as you pointed out, and I agree with you, is for visual dialogue. We do have some work on visual dialogue, which I did not talk about today, where we used this and very similar models to it. And again, there I would argue that diversity for visual dialogue is actually something important. If you're talking about an image today with your friend and you talk about the same image tomorrow, very likely you're going to ask different questions. You might ask the questions about the same content, but you will ask them in a different way. And also for devices to maintain to remain engaging, they should exhibit some diversity behavior, right? If I talk to my cell phone at this point in time and ask about the weather, I guess particularly if I'm living in California, I always get the same answer.
So my second question is about diversity. So you talk about a lot of things about diversity. So diversity can mean a lot of difference in like sentiment or different parameters. So, but in this case, so in your case, you have been talking about different objects that you are describing in the image, right? So how can we control the diversity of other things like maybe I want to use different attributes to describe the same object, but so I think your case is more like the novel object caption. So what's the difference between the diversity and the novel object caption?
Right, so I guess in this case, I should emphasize what we focused on was diversity in terms of the sentence structure that is produced, like 2 grams and 4 grams. What you're talking about is, I guess, diversity at a more semantic high-level level, which is, I think, very important and very interesting going forward. We did not look too much at these aspects, but I think this is a very, very interesting direction going forward, and I would argue actually a very important direction too. You know, when we talk to friends, right, our language is very subtle. There is a lot of nuances that play a role and that are important, which at this point in time we don't really model adequately, I would argue, or we're nowhere close to modeling them very well. And these are all aspects which we have not looked into, but which are, I think, very valuable looking into going forward. Thank you.
Let's thank Alex again for the great talk.